I write about performance art and experimental music. And I was actually lucky enough to be at UIC when Liz was doing her MFA here. And it's been super great to sort of like watch her work grow and change, get weirder and funnier and more very Liz. And so I'm super stoked to talk to her today about her new show that is up. And super stoked also to hear her introduce herself right now.
Cool. Thanks, Chris. And my name is Liz McCarthy, and I'm going to be walking around and talking about the show Comprised of. And the work in the show was started in 2019, but primarily has been made in the past year. And then it was canceled during the stay-at-home order, and then we redid the date. And so there's a bunch of work that was made sort of over the stay-at-home order, so sort of responding to that. And I'm just going to start off by playing some of the work. So all the pieces in this exhibition are whistles, so I just want to sort of show that in action. All right, Chris, do you want to start off by doing some questions?
Yeah, I'd love to. I mean, we can just jump right off of what I was just watching you do a little bit. I love so much, I've always loved, but I love so much with these whistle sculptures that you make that watching you handle them or watching other people handle them in that way where you have to kind of twist your body a certain way, or certain ones are heavier, and so it kind of is going to affect the way that you're actually interacting with it. And that always sort of makes me think about, you know, the way in which your sculptures kind of ask for like a certain type of engagement or a certain type of like bodily contortion or something like that, which makes me feel like you're trying to hit all the marks for experience. Like, how do we experience this kind of sculpture, or how do we experience like a work of art in general? And I love that these works are always sort of these hybrids between, you know, a static object, sort of static sculpture, and something more functional, like a musical instrument in a way. And so, I don't know, maybe we can start off with you talking, you know, what you think the importance or the impetus or one of those other I words is for you in terms of making whistles and these sculptures, you know, the form and the function and all that. Maybe that's a good place to start it off.
Yeah. Yeah, so I've been making whistles now for about like 5 years. And I had started out making kind of like smaller single use whistles and sort of giving those away. And I think I was really interested in the way that the whistle itself was sort of tied to a performance, but then it was also kind of this like dumb and easy object to use because you just kind of blow into it. But I kept thinking about this idea of use and performance and how objects, especially like functional objects, end up kind of like pushing your body to tell you how to use it. So with a whistle, it has a mouthpiece, and so you're blowing air into that, and sort of your air in your lungs is sort of filling that cavity and producing sound. Just the way like a mug tells you how to use it because it has a handle. So we've all kind of been trained to kind of have an understanding of how to use functional objects. And then I keep going back to kind of making these in ceramic form because it's, tied to kind of like these functional objects, or sort of the tradition of function. Does that answer your question, Chris?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's interesting that, the forms of these sculptures, the form of your sculptures, are almost kind of demanding like a different sort of bodily engagement, right? And that kind of the way that we're supposed to interact with them, I feel like is sort of mirrored in the form of the sculpture itself, if that makes sense. So again, I really do love. Yeah.
For sure. And I think like, I used to make, when I was making the single use ones, it was more about like people laying them on their own. And now because the little whistles are all sort of packed into one sculpture, you kind of have to like juggle and share it so multiple people can play on the same object. Is that sort of what you're saying, Chris?
Yeah, that's pretty much it. Yeah. And I think it feels almost like you're sort of like, attempting in two ways to both kind of revise the way that you're supposed to, handle like something musical or handle something sculptural. And while at the same time, you're sort of asking for like a kind of participation from people. And it's really interesting to think about like both of those moves in a moment, like right now, in which we can't put our mouth on something, like we should like touch something that other people have touched. And so, I mean, I guess what I'm thinking about a little bit right now is we talked about how this show was supposed to happen pre-stay-at-home order. And now that it has happened, was the work different at all before that?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think I was thinking more about kind of these like whole kind of mutant objects or kind of mutant forms, so that were sort of like the figure. But then, there was a lot of sort of psychological stuff, I think, that got pushed on to the sculptures that were made sort of during the stay-at-home order, where I kept making the show basically. Definitely like, this piece is, it's sort of like a base form, and then it has all these different pieces. And so these arms are kind of like torn off and then kind of like fused back on. And I think, I was really thinking about sort of these psychological things that were happening in my head at the moment and how those started kind of playing out in these forms where it was like, just feeling like sort of ripped apart or not really understanding what was happening, and then kind of trying to put those pieces back together to like create some kind of whole form again. These pieces were also definitely like super important during kind of my stay-at-home experience. There are all these like smaller pieces, and I was making them thinking about my body in all these different positions that I was in during the stay-at-home order, where I just kind of was like laying on my couch. I own a business, so I was kind of trying to figure out what was happening. That I was teaching online, but also just trying to figure out how to like go outside and what my responsibility was. And it just felt like my responsibility was to sort of be this blob. And a lot of these are like not necessarily like based on my body, but more the way that my body was feeling at the time. So I kind of like emphasized like, swollen stomach, just because I was sort of like in these positions that I couldn't really get out of to kind of be and exist in like space. But I was also thinking a lot about how my own body was so much an instrument in that sort of pandemic space.
And so when you say, like, you know, the responsibility to be a blob, you know, do you think then that, like, is there sort of an anxiousness that we do this show, maybe, or am I like over analyzing the usual?
What did you say? An anxiety?
Yeah, like, I mean, do you think that, like, you know, in terms of, well, we were talking a little bit before about playfulness and stuff like that, and like, it does feel like, you know, COVID and 2020 in general and all this stuff has made kind of the ways that we're kind of typically going about play like a little more fraught. And so I'm just sort of curious, you know, you said like a second ago, like what is your responsibility of your body as a blob? And that feels sort of like such like a kind of maybe a little anxious, because it is sort of like,
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, I think like even before COVID, a lot of the work in the show is sort of about anxiety, or sort of about, yeah, like, you know, there's these sort of positions. Like this one is, you know, this is one of the first pieces that was made before COVID, but even this piece, I was just thinking about sort of these forms that aren't necessarily like sort of erect and like the vessel form, but rather kind of like the drooping form, and sort of like what is the value, how do we judge value based on sort of these positions of the vessels? Yeah, and then, you know, just these guys, you know, are more of their own sort of solid piece. They're all one piece, but they're built modularly, so they can be kind of pulled apart or sort of disembodied in a way. So sort of thinking about these sort of forms that sort of break apart or kind of made up of many objects, or even this piece is like, you know, also made before COVID, and really thinking about these positions of the object as vulnerable or sort of fragile. And a lot of these, I'm kind of thinking about my own body in these positions, and sort of how my body is becoming an object, but also how this object is becoming an instrument. And I think that sort of relates to this idea of performance, where, you know, I have this instrument that I'm sort of moving through the world. Yeah, and I think it's like I'm performing that, and then these objects sort of suggest their own performance, or sort of they end up mediating a performance or a play, to kind of like mix up maybe the like known ways that we understand using our bodies. So like playing this instrument, you know, this arm can pull apart, and then I can play that, and then somebody else can play this one. So you're sort of sharing the object and sharing space, but at the same time, it's kind of coming from the sort of mutant being that's sort of mediating this connection between two people in the space. Yeah, so I would say in the past, I think my pieces have been more playful, but I don't feel very playful these days. So I think that there's a lot more, I think, anxiety, but definitely there's a sort of comedy in that anxiety.
yeah, no, definitely. And I think that still, you know, despite all the circumstances, always kind of resonates with your stuff, you know. Let's, in this one, can we talk for a second about the staging a little bit, or like the display? Because the one you just showed me, you know, it feels very like the body's like almost sprawled out in this very dramatic, like theatrical fashion, with this, you know, blanket kind of wrapped around it underneath it. It feels very, you know, tragic almost in that kind of like dramatic way, versus the other one with the drawer on it, which feels like much more kind of like maybe domestic, or kind of more like having a specific sort of function. The one that had the pull-out drawer. Sorry. Yeah, that one over there. I'm curious,
Yeah, I was definitely thinking about sort of like the way that we use functional objects or sort of these vessels in domestic space. And so like this one, I was kind of holding this, or had this in this drawer. I was thinking about sort of like, you know, where you keep your like sex toys next to the bed. It's like in this kind of weird little drawer that's like the functional object. But there's also sort of this voyeurism in it of like sort of this like sort of whistle instrument being kind of hidden, as opposed to kind of like it being mounted or sort of being more displayed as a sort of functional object. And with these pieces that are like laying down, like this piece over here, I was thinking a lot about sort of the way that we're packing and handling pieces. And so a lot of these are kind of like thinking about creating or boxing and sort of like caring for the objects. At the same time, they're kind of becoming these like beds or sort of structures. And this is sort of like a packing blanket or sort of throw blanket, and like the way that's sort of cradling these objects. And I definitely am like interested in sculptures, you know, like resisting the horizontal element, or so many sculptures or sort of decorative items have this sort of horizontal status. And so this one is so much about like the verticality and it kind of being a mess and falling apart. And a lot of these pieces can kind of come off and be put back on. So like when it's displayed, so it has like legs and is laying down. The piece is not necessarily finished in any one position, but can be kind of displayed in many positions.
Yeah, and that feels to me sort of, you know, like again, kind of nice mirroring that's happening here between, you know, having kind of like multiple options in terms of the way that you're going to sculpture. Also, you know, like having different permutations, I think, of how the sculpture can be put together or how it's going to be laid out. So I think this sort of, you know, the back and forth between, you know, performance and body and sculptural really are like coming together super nice in this work right here, for sure.
Yeah.
Maybe, go ahead.
Maybe to add to that too, like definitely, like I was thinking about like I worked at an auction house for a long time, and a lot of the show was sort of thinking about this like box lot, or just kind of like the sort of trash items that get all put together, but then versus like the items that get to be whole. It's sort of comprised of this sort of thinking about, yeah, it's like this position of value, right? And you know, so I've had this, I wanted to have this mantle as part of the show because it was like important that these were sort of in this sort of centered position, but also like raised up on sort of the mantle place. And they get to kind of be these sort of singular objects. At the same time, they're sort of missing limbs and sort of have still like these holes and protrusions, so they're not totally whole. And they have like an interior space, but they're being read as sort of like these singular forms.
Yeah. So do you think that there's like a hierarchy here? Is there like a hierarchy of sculptures? Like the mantle plate, the drawer versus the sex drawer. Is there kind of like, are you sort of evening out the playing field, you think? Or do you think, you know, I think that's just like a question I've always sort of thought about, or at least something I've always noticed. You know, like the whistles that you do, you always sort of give those away. You know, so when I go to somebody's apartment, there's always like one of your whistles in some part of their house. They're everywhere. And it's the thing where I think about that, where it's sort of like, this is like such a, you know, like one of a kind, precious, unique art object in that way, you know, and it's functional and like part of an experience, but also like you're gifting it to people, I think, puts it on like sort of like a different sort of sculptural ideal maybe, you know, because there seems to be always a tug of war between, as I think, work talks about a lot, a coffee mug, the function of a coffee mug versus, a, large sculptural form, gallery. And I think, with this show, I really like this sort of using the display to kind of play with those kind of distinctions a little bit, that what goes on the mantle, what goes away, what is a sculpture, what stands upright. You're working with like so many great questions, I think, right now. And I guess, one of the things that I did notice that's a little different with this show is I think it's to the left of you, right behind you, is the kind of full body sculpture you have. Not that one. That one. Yeah. This one. And this one feels like, a little bit of a, distinct work in this show, and maybe that I've seen from you. And that it's sort of like it's much more legible as like, a kind of person, or at least some kind of like corporeal model form in a way. I'm curious, like, especially with the scale, even, it's a much bigger sculpture than usual. So, I mean, what was your thought process with this one among these other ones that you had?
Yeah, I mean, I guess so. A lot, like I think a lot about like this book Dawn by Octavia Butler, and in this book there's these like mutants, or not mutants, they're like aliens that are like mediating sex between humans, so that they can produce this like evolved version of a human, but like sort of like the mediating form is like a living being. And maybe just think a lot about how like objects are always like mediating us, but then like this is starting to become sort of a more anthropomorphic object, that's sort of mediating maybe a different way of kind of considering your own body, or kind of considering my own body. But at the same time, it sort of like has this ability to kind of come apart, or sort of be kind of understood as an object. So I think I was kind of playing with that idea of like my body being this like sort of form or instrument mediating things, but also the way that we like rely so much on like objects to just constantly mediate our own bodies, where it's like we're on the phone all the time. And even in a digital world, like this mediation has like changed and it's become so virtual. So this feels like, making these has become so much more about like making this sort of like really corporal, solid object that has the potential for mediating. But also at the same time, like what you're saying with the sculpture, I think that it's like sculpture itself, takes up space, exists in the room. So it's also like my body is like relating to it as a sculpture, but also starting to kind of project my own sort of desire and sort of trying to figure out what it means, and kind of pushing me to maybe, or kind of thinking about my own self. It's like, this surface is like sweating. When I was applying this, it's like about just like dripping glaze and throwing glaze on it. This is like a kind of like glazed fault that I kind of created. So it's just like becoming like blistering. So kind of, thinking about how these forms start to also reflect these sort of like material processes that are happening in my own body, where it's like sweating and like eating and peeing and shitting and like crying, where those start to come out in a similar way, but in, a different material.
How do people, in this particular show, I know it's been sort of, by appointment or a little bit limited come. How have people been interacting with these for this show?
Yeah, I think like it's interesting because it's like way less about kind of handling them in the show, but for these ones, definitely I want them to be kind of handled, and I think that's something we're all sort of, or I'm missing a lot, is just like picking up and holding things. And I think with these objects, they feel really like they should be held and kind of touched. So it's been like nice to kind of like allow people to sort of take it and pick it up and hold it, right, and kind of turn it. And definitely we're like blocked from actually like blowing them and performing them. So I think that there's like a lot of sort of red intention, right? Or like, so it's a sort of possible or sort of speculative way that you maybe use the object, but right now it's sort of existing on its own as just sort of a possibility for physical interaction.
How does that feel, for you in terms of, because it's, as somebody who like is loosely musical, I have this like impulse, like if there's like a piano or some whatever in front of me, to like want to like tinker with it, like to want to like mess with it. And so I feel like, this idea that there's like a bunch of semi-musical instruments that are begging me to play them and I can't touch them. Like, how does that feel for you as like the person who kind of makes the invitations almost to do this? Does it change anything, or is it just sort of like you have to kind of accept that it's taking this form now?
I think maybe I just like I've been thinking about them more as like sculptures, and it's like, even with sculpture, they're sort of referencing, in sculpture, you're like referencing things or sort of replicating things and abstracting them. And I think that these have kind of just they're becoming these abstractions rather than literal. But I don't know. I think that like we're all sort of living in a virtual world right now where there's like the possibility of something happening that we can't actually access. And so maybe that they're sort of a reflection of that sort of state right now where everything is just like a virtual idea. Like it could be this, it could be actually in this viewing room, but the viewing room is like a 3D model. So there's like this sort of potential of like, you could play this, but you can't. And I think we're all in that position right now where you can't. It's like the thing is desirable to put your mouth on and play, but you can't do it.
Yeah, no, and it's one of those things. I've thought about this a lot, and I'm thinking about it in terms of your show even too. This kind of almost like a little tease in a way. Like trying to figure out how to kind of do shows right now. Especially, I would imagine, especially for someone who makes work that has to be experienced. Like so much of what you're talked about or even showed us today is to do with like sensation and touch and picking things up and like taste. And it's one of those things where like I see this with painters, and I've seen this like watching like the frieze openings and things like that, where it's like you can see it but you can't really interact with it in a way. And like I'm wondering in terms of like putting this show together, were you thinking about that? Were you thinking a little bit about like what the limitations were going to have to be in terms of how people were going to experience this? Or did you just kind of like, I just want to do this the way I think it should look, kind of thing?
Definitely, I feel like I've made more pedestals than I would normally make, where things became way more about that, where like there's a lot more sort of the structure that it lives on. When I think in the past I've put more things on the ground, so maybe things just like sort of shifted into like a more sculptural space. Yeah, is that?
Yeah, no, it's just something really. One of the things I was really looking forward to about talking to you about this is that, like, again, had like the benefit of knowing you and seeing your work and people over and over and over again, like, kind of have this delight and joy or curiosity of helping off with. And it's one of those things, like, it still feels the same when I see this show, on Zoom. But it is something where I think about, like, I'm just like quietly like, I want to touch it. I want to do that thing I do when I go to your shows where I'm watching somebody like break their back to play something, And I think, as a viewer, it's something that's like mildly frustrating, but at the same time, I'm so glad that these shows are still happening and that you're still, thinking about all this stuff, particularly in light of how difficult it is to do that. So
Yeah.
less a question, more of just observation, I think.
And I think that that's like maybe a good way to kind of like maybe tie up the conversation a little bit too, right? Of like, just thinking about the issues, especially of performative objects in the sort of way of viewing things, but like how the work can become influenced by that, sort of like this like visceral inability, that we're kind of you're like looking at this piece about sort of bodily mediation while being mediated through a digital screen.
Yeah, no, definitely. And so, I mean, how long is the show is up for?
Till October 10th. There's one last hours, October 10th from 4 to 6. So it's kind of a fast turnaround. So there's still another opportunity. This weekend, this Sunday from 3 to 5, I will be here. And then next Saturday from 4 to 6. And then you can always make appointments with the gallery at different times throughout the week to come see the show. In person, visceral, body, to do this.
Cool. Thank you so much for that, Liz. Are there any, I guess this is like the point where like there may be questions, but I don't know if there are any questions. I don't even know how you find that out.
I think we can look at them in chat, maybe.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't see any right now, but if anyone has any questions, yeah, now would be the time to ask them. But yeah, I guess I'll just second that. Yeah, I think here's a question. Here's a question, Liz, that just came in. I'm going to read it out loud to you. It says, can Liz talk more about the ideas of assigning value and the things you do to match their values? When I saw the pieces on the mantle in the gallery, I was thinking how it reminded me of looking at valuable objects in semi-public, semi-private places. Places you need to get tickets. Places like you need to get tickets and make appointments for.
Yeah, for sure. That's a great question. So we can look at, this piece, I was thinking a lot about the tradition of blue and white porcelain, and American potters use a lot of stoneware, so I wanted to kind of make the blue and white stoneware piece. But I was thinking a lot about working in the auction house, we would get in these Ming Dynasty Chinese vases that would just be worth $30,000, and go live on a mantle, as opposed to sort of these box lots. But I think that there's this cultural value that builds up through history and material, and so much of this piece is blue and white was this amazing tradition that happened in China, and then it moved to the Middle East. And then it moved to North Africa, and then it moved to Southern Italy, and it sort of moved its way up through Western Europe. But now it's sort of we think about it as the sort of, in the Western home, we have the blue and white object that's on the mantelpiece as a sort of status symbol, a symbol of history and pedigree and provenance. So I was kind of thinking about that in relationship to kind of even my own body, and it's okay, at what point does this body valued? How is this body valued? Through gender, through race, so I think it was I'm kind of pulling things to that, or kind of this is in sort of a bowing position where it's sort of subservient, or it's becoming a sort of subservient object. So I think a lot about this sort of ritual element of the whistles, but also sort of how we value objects and sort of place them different places. And definitely by making them useful, they can sometimes become less valuable versus having them become sculptural, where they become more valuable. And sort of how does performance start to kind of play with that? Or maybe how does the object influence performance within space? Does that answer that question?
I think so. Yeah, I agree. I think the presentation also adds a lot to that sort of relationship to value. And as you were saying, you made so many pedestals over the last months to put this together. I think that also changes the relationship to the body, to the object. So I think there's a lot there that maybe is in that question. There's one other question. How does thinking about the performativity of the objects manifest itself while you're working with clay? What goes through your mind as you are teasing out these moments out of the clay?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I like some of this stuff. I was looking at old these etchings from the 16th century that are kind of like these sort of like monsters and like kind of horrific gods like torturing each other. And so I've been thinking about that for like this piece. So I'm kind of like making these initial sketches, and then I was sort of imagining my own body in like these different positions. So usually I'm sort of making these sketches and sort of thinking about it, but then when you're actually working with the material, like clay has so much of its own agency to kind of like push back against you, which I like really love about the material, where it sort of like does what it wants to. So you can kind of allow the clay to just like slump and kind of curve. So like, especially in these pieces, I was really like letting the clay do that by itself, where the clay gets to kind of like, you know, have its own form that it wants to like contort into. And I think like, you know, with our own bodies, we're using them as these sort of performative objects. I'm performing for you with my body in the role of artist and maker. But I think like, you know, we kind of put this intention into the clay. But it's interesting with clay because it like kind of holds this sort of reference to stone, reference to the earth, and also just like intense like cultural history. Humans have been using it for like 40,000 years. So the clay has its own sort of performative history in the way that you're kind of like thinking about all the sort of history that you're attached to as soon as you start using the material, and maybe the sort of responsibility to kind of like consider that, you know, when using it. And definitely like they're kind of like lumpy and kind of hold my touch, but it's also like the clay, each clay body has its own sort of personality.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's all the questions we have now, unless anyone else has any others, or if either of you have anything you'd like to add.
No, thank you so much for taking a look at this show. This has definitely been a really different and interesting way of kind of existing in the gallery. And thank you so much, Chris, for your like super thoughtful and wonderful responses. Thanks for organizing this.
Yeah, thank you both, and the gallery 062 for putting on the exhibition. And yeah, I'd encourage everyone to go look at and join the other conversations we have coming up tomorrow, Saturday and Sunday. They're on our website at chicagogalleryopen.org.
Yeah, I was looking at the other lineups. There's some really great ones. Like Faisal is really amazing. Yeah, I think Goldfinch has a thing. And just want to say thank you so much to SY, who I'm going to flip on to. She's been such an incredible help in making this exhibition happen and making this like, you know, happen during this really weird moment.
Thanks.
Thank you all. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Take care.
Yeah.
Bye.
Yep.